Hi everyone, it's Margie DiPaolo with Choices with Margie podcast, and we're here for part two with Boulay, who in part one was talking about her journey through the foster care system, and we're kind of just talking about the second part, which is your journey. And you know you don't like that word, but your journey of how you dealt with your childhood and your choice to keep growing and keep what did Rainey say?
Work hard or
Work-
you're nothing but a piece of shit.
Work hard.
The rest of my formidable years were much of the same. Just very inconsistent. And, Joe and I at this point, he made a decision for the most part to stay with my mother. That was his choice. He wanted to stay with her. And I actually made a decision to go and stay with Rainey for
Oh.
for a little bit of time. And we were together as a unit for a little while, and then when that split up, Joe stayed with my mom, and I went and stayed with Rainey until I was 15. And Rainey went to jail for a DUI conviction for a length of time. And at this point, my mother was so far gone, I didn't even know where she was at this point, that, the state of Maine gave me two options. You're too old to place, so we can send you to a group home, or we can emancipate you from the state. And, like I said, I was an amazing kid. I'm tooting my own horn here a little bit, but I never caused an ounce of problem ever. When I had a school to go to, I went every day. My homework was done. I was a straight A student. After school, I went to the library because it was quiet, and I would sit there and I would read.
So did any of the kids, as you're going through this, I know we talked about in part one, but did you have anybody that befriended you?
You would make friends for a short period of time, but at this point, you would learn that people come and go so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes time to build strong relationships with people. That I just had never done that.
Mm-hmm.
Ever.
Do you think that affects you today?
100%.
Really?
100%.
In what way?
I mean, my circle of friends is very, very strong, or very, very small.
Yeah.
I like to call myself like the best bad friend in the world.
So do you let people in?
No.
You let me in.
I did. I do to a certain extent, but in the back of your mind, there's always that you have to protect yourself because people aren't here permanently.
Okay, great. Dominic, I'm gonna cry.
I know.
Oh my God.
Darn it, Margie. We were doing so good.
Oh God.
We were doing so good.
I know.
When you grow up.
I'm such a sob sister.
When you grow up the way that I do, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how, normal of a life you can create for yourself. Mm-hmm. You're not without demons.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible. It's impossible to be able to get rid of all those insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
But relationship building was just something that I didn't know how to do. And I think it's a learned thing in your childhood with those connections and those friends. And I just never learned how to do that.
So how do you think you chose to be like the good kid? And then Joe, I mean, I know he was dealing with anger, but, how do you think you just was like, I'm going to be the good kid?
So I think I was always resentful of Joe because he had a relationship with my mother.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't. And I was always a nuance to her. But from the time I was little, I always pushed back on, what are we doing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, I don't want to say that I was like the why kid, but like, why aren't we eating dinner? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we sleeping in a different place every night? Like, why can't I stay at the same school for more than 6 months?
Do you think she also resented you because you saw through her? Like,
Yes.
like I'm seeing through your bullshit. I'm
Correct.
seeing what you're doing to us.
Correct.
And I'm calling you out on it.
And I used to do that all the time.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm that person too.
Yeah.
I see through people's bullshit.
Yeah.
And it drives people crazy.
And she was a master manipulator.
Ugh.
And that is a, you know, very classic trait of somebody with, you know, a drug problem.
Yeah.
They will lie and steal and cheat and do, you know, whatever they need to do. And so I always called her out on it. But, you know, I always felt dirty from the way that people looked at us. And so I knew from a young age that fueled me. That judgment fueled me to not be like that. And I remember being little, saying to myself, you know, and little, I'm, you know, could be 13, 14, 15 years old. You know, I don't want to live like this. I don't want to do this. And Joe just didn't care. And it wasn't until much later in life where I realized, and I'm going to skip right ahead, you know, my brother Joe spent his entire life battling a drug addiction. And you know, I'm going to skip ahead. I went on to, you know, go to college, and I left at 17 years old. I was emancipated from the state of Maine. I made a decision to graduate from high school early. I had a 1985 Volkswagen Golf that nothing worked in it. No, the gas gauge didn't work, the window didn't roll up, the seat didn't move, it didn't have third or fifth gear. I had to hold it up with a ponytail holder attached to the vent. And I packed 2 boxes worth of stuff, those were my worldly possessions at 17 years old, into the back of this Volkswagen Golf, and I just started to drive. And I had saved $900 and said, I'm going to go to Disney World. I've never been. It's like, you know, I watched all these kids that I went to school with do all these vacations, and I had never been on a vacation in my life. And I said, I'm just going to go. And so I made it to Orlando, Florida, and I applied to college when I got there, and I had, you know, perfect grades, you know, not perfect attendance because I never went to school, but studying wasn't something I ever really had to do. I could just show up and take a test and, you know, pass. And so I, you know, made it to Orlando, and I applied to school when I got there, and I lived out of my car for an entire year on college campus. And
you lived out of the Gulf?
The Volkswagen Golf.
Oh, that's such a little car too.
Thank God I'm a tiny person. I live, and, you know, and I couch hopped a lot. You know, I did make some friends while I was there, but, you know, I was working 2 jobs, you know, to try to put myself through school and save money for a place to live. I was showering in the campus, and doing all of this. And so during this time, Joe and I really had very separate lives.
Yeah, I was just going to say, where is he at this point?
There was a large section of time where, you know, we didn't really spend a lot of time talking. You know, this is kind of pre-cell phone at this point. You know, once a year. But once I left, man, I never went back. And, you know, I was kind of forging ahead. And then I got pregnant. And I got pregnant in Orlando. And at this point, I had no family.
How old?
20. I was 20 years old.
So you have a 23-year-old kid?
20. She just turned 22.
What the heck?
2 weeks ago. Yeah, she graduates from college next week. I know.
Where's she going?
She went to Fredonia. And then I have my 20-year-old is at St. Bonaventure. So I was pregnant. I was told I have a medical condition. I was told you will never be able to have children. So I go to Orlando. I, you know, meet this guy. I get pregnant. He doesn't want anything to do with the baby. His mother offered me a sum of money to have an abortion and go away. That, you know, to me wasn't an option. And so I remember sitting there saying, well, what the hell am I going to do now? and that was really the driving force that I needed in my life. And I said, well, I'm going to pack up my Volkswagen Golf and I'm going to go back home, because even though, what I have here is nothing, but at least there it's familiar. So I went home and I had, Rainey helped me, a little bit, and I, went to social services and said, what can I do? I have health insurance, I don't have anything. I have this medical condition, this miracle baby, whatever. And so I got, Medicaid, continued going to school. And, on April 16th, 2001, this 5-pound baby came into the world 8 weeks early. And that was the moment that I truly had a choice. And I remember looking at her in the NICU, sitting in a chair with my hand through the little hole, holding her little tiny finger and making her a promise that not a day in her life would she ever feel the pain that I endured in my life. I'm 20 years old, I'm all by myself. I don't have a soul in the world to turn to for any kind of guidance. And I remember thinking, I don't have any idea how to be a mother. None.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a nurse who was in the NICU with me. And I was there all the time. I had a very high risk pregnancy due to this medical condition that I had. And she said to me, Annie, you know what not to do. You're going to be fine. You know what not to do.
It's amazing how one little statement from somebody can just make your whole psyche change.
Yeah.
Of how you're seeing something.
Yeah. And I had never in a day in my life, Margie, felt sorry for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we talk about the path that my brother took and the path that I took, the major difference between those two things were that I never felt like anybody owed me anything. And even now as an adult, I look back on it and I can tell the story without crying. I can tell these things without getting emotional, because there's just a bunch of shit that happened a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't change any of it because it made me an incredible parent, an incredible businesswoman. So we took Whitney home, and I named Whitney after a teacher that I had in high school.
I thought if you said Whitney Houston, I was going to be like, what the hell?
No, his name was Mr. Whitney, and he was my ninth grade English teacher. And he was an incredible human.
Does he know that you think that?
I don't know. I don't think so. I had him for
Thank
9th.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney, wherever you are.
Yeah, I had him for 9th and 10th grade. And I spent Christmas at his house one year because I didn't have anywhere to go. And everybody knew I didn't have any parents. I was on my own. I didn't need a note because I was late. I didn't need a dismissal. I was on my own. I didn't have any parents. I was legally an adult. I got a driver's license at 15, because now you're legally an adult. So my whole world revolved around Whitney. And I met my ex-husband when she was 6 years old, and he was from Buffalo. And I made a choice at that point to leave. And
where'd you meet him?
I met him in Maine. He was working on he just graduated college. It was his first job, and his job was taking him on the road.
Okay.
And I met him on a blind date. And, we started to build a life after that. And, 2 years later, my daughter Madison was born. And when we traveled with his job for a couple of years. And, I continued my education and continued to work hard. And, I was always in retail and, was a store manager at 20 years old. For Oshkosh Bagosh.
In Buffalo?
No. I started in Massachusetts. And then I went to work for the Weather Vane.
Oh my gosh. Girl, you're talking to an old retailer here. I mean, the mall stores.
Yeah, the mall stores.
Oh my God, the Weather Vane.
The Weather Vane. I'm aging myself now. And so, we left. And I worked my way up and raised my kids, and my ex-husband had this amazing family
In Buffalo?
in Buffalo. And
Buffalo people are good people.
yeah, he just had parents that were, his mother became my best friend. And
is she still your best friend?
no, maybe that can be a part 3 on the de-escalation of my Pollyanna life. But we had this, for the first time I was able to kind of like breathe. And so parallel to me living, this life where, I was the vice president of the school board for 5 years, and I became a district manager for Cole Haan, and I, drove a Mercedes, and I had this like this, I worked really hard for everything I had, and, my kids.
You're making it,
right? So I'm doing this, and I'm doing this because, I made a choice to never feel sorry for myself. Not one day. And I knew if I was going to get out of where I was, and which was just perpetual chaos all the time, spinning, I had to make that decision myself. Because it would have been very easy to stay within that cycle.
So talk a little bit about what happened to Joe.
So Joe never really could get out of that cycle. And, the communication we had over, the probably 15 years from the time I moved to Buffalo, it was probably 13 years from the time I moved to Buffalo to when he died, it was really about things that he needed.
So he passed away.
He did pass away. He took his own life. And, there was a critical moment in Joe's life that happened in 2003 that changed the path of him. My mother took her own life.
Wow.
On November 7th, 2003, 4 days after my daughter Madison was born. And, for me, this is going to sound very callous when I say this out loud, but for me, I felt this enormous sense of peace for her at that moment. We had no relationship for years leading up to this. I mean, there was not a chance I was going to let her around my children. They were just not going to be exposed to this environment. But Joe started to spiral a little bit after that. I fueled myself into my kids and creating an entirely new life for myself that was void of toxicity and chaos and pain and trauma, and really just put one foot in front of the other every single day for those 2 girls. And he didn't have that ability. Even when he had his own child, he just couldn't get past the trauma. And he didn't know how to close the door on that.
Did he ever have counseling?
So when he was a small child, he did. But I think you have to remember that when you're in the thick of drug addiction and pain and trauma, and you are self-medicating to forget, that is not something that you think about.
Right.
In the week leading up to his death, he did try to seek help. He went to 6 different facilities, rehab facilities, 2 ERs, a private doctor and urgent care, and basically begged and pleaded with them for some help at that point. And all 6 facilities turned him away because he didn't have health insurance. And so ultimately he made the decision to end his own life. And he had tried multiple times before. There were, probably a dozen suicide attempts prior to that. And
to just relieve himself from any kind of pain that he's in.
Yeah, he was really trapped in his own mind,
Yeah.
Margie. Like just an intense and constant pain that, like, even couldn't I couldn't understand it. I couldn't sympathize with it, and I lived with it.
Yeah.
We lived this parallel life for, the first 15 years of
Yeah.
my life. But he couldn't close the door. And I remember him saying to me a couple times, like, Annie, nobody ever gave me anything. Nobody ever gave me anything. Nobody ever gave me a chance. Nobody pushed me forward. And I remember being angry with him and saying, nobody ever gave me anything either, Joe. Like, nobody handed me this life on a silver platter. Nobody. I had to go earn it.
Right. I know. I have the same kind of situation with one of my siblings who really has struggled with drugs, and my husband and I have done really well, but we've worked so hard our whole
Right.
lives. And I remember him saying something about my life. He says, "You're so lucky." I'm like, "Luck has nothing to do with it.
Right.
We both worked. We both worked hard. We never stopped.
Right.
It's the choice you make. You just keep going.
Right.
So here you are, this district sales manager and successful. I just have to give you kudos. Do you think you have any kind of PTSD, or do you think you're just like stay the course here, girl?
So I will tell you, when my husband and I got divorced 6 years ago, it was the first time in my life that I ever fell apart. And it came crashing all at once. And it was, divorce is such like a common occurrence nowadays. Like, 70% of people who get married are going to end up divorced now. It used to be 30, then it was 50. 70% of people who get married get divorced. Why? Because it's easier to leave than to try to fix yourself.
Right. Hello.
Right. But I mean, it truly rocked my world. And I did fall apart, and it was because he was the single only human being in my life who had ever been there, who had ever understood. He was the only person who knew every single story, all the grit, all the details that you leave out when you have a casual conversation, all the stuff I left out in this conversation. He was that person. And that was the only family that I had ever had.
So what is your relationship with him now?
I have zero relationship with him.
Really?
Yeah.
What about your kids?
My daughter Madison is very close with him, and my daughter Whitney, has a limited relationship with him now. But it took, when I tell you I fell apart, I fell apart. So it was, divorce happened, then I had a cancer diagnosis 4 months later, and then 4 months later, my brother committed suicide. So it was all of these things. So I really lost, in one foul swoop, everything. I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost, my health, I lost his entire family. And that was a choice. And it was a choice that I made. He had an affair with a close friend of mine. She was expecting a baby from him. It tore the entire family apart.
Yeah, that's your foundation, just gone.
It's gone. And I sat there and said, I wasn't strong enough, because it had taken me these 15 years to learn how to love.
And you were married 15 years?
Yeah. And I wasn't strong enough to be around what was about to happen.
No.
There was a baby, and I remember thinking to myself, I was so angry. So angry, and I'm sitting in a rental house at this point, and I had to start completely over. I gave him everything. I pretty much just walked away.
Did you have your girls?
50%. I didn't argue about it.
Okay.
He took 50, even Whitney, who he had really no legal right to. But it wasn't their fault, and they still have two parents. And so for me, that was a non-issue. I wasn't going to punish my kids because he made a bad choice. It was 50% of the time, and I do remember, the first time the girls walked out the door with overnight bags. I didn't know if I was going to make it through the night.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was probably the single worst night of my entire life.
Wow.
And so I was in a bad spot. I was in a bad, bad, bad spot. And I remember sitting there saying, okay, sitting on the porch, and I had just lost everything. I lost my entire family. It was the only family I'd ever had. I knew that I couldn't put them in a position where they had to choose. And if it was just the woman and my ex-husband, it would be different. But now there's a baby coming. And it is not that baby's fault. So I remember sitting there on the stairs and saying, I have to walk away. I have to walk away because this is all going to be too painful to continue to relive a life that I loved so much. That in order for me to heal myself, I can't be part of it anymore. And so I did. I walked away. And
But here you are today. You're okay.
here I am today. You know what it took?
Are you in a relationship with anybody today?
I am.
Okay.
I am. And it took, it's funny too, because I look back at this life that I had when I was married, and, on the school board and the country club and, the suits and, I became this very stoic person, which was a very unauthentic version of myself.
You can say that now, but I think when you were in the thick of it, you thought, I'm making it.
I'm making it, right? I'm making it. And I was obsessed with making it.
Mm-hmm.
And
now you're like, I don't care. I'm going to be me.
Yeah. And so it was a good journey over the last couple of years. It took, probably the first 2 or 3 years for me to figure out who I was. Who I was without him, who I was without this family, who I was on my own in a city where I have no connections. It was the right thing to do for my kids to stay here, and to stay grounded. And, I kind of had to figure it out on my own.
And you wanted them to have some kind of foundation too.
And it wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
I made a lot of bad choices those first couple years, out of grief. And, but I saw, a lot of therapy. And what happened, emotionally and mentally for me is a lot of the stuff that happened when I was a kid, the bad stuff, that you keep locked away. My mind had really packed it away, and I didn't remember it. And then the trauma
triggered it.
And so it all rushed back. In flashbacks, and, nightmares started happening, and, scents and smells and things like that would trigger some memory, that would just drop me to my knees. And at the time I would pick up the phone and be like, Joe, did this happen? Because he was still alive then. Like, Joe, did this happen? And he would be like, yeah. And I'd be like, well, that sucks. I would be like, wow.
So how are you today?
I'm good today.
You're good?
I'm good.
So not as many triggers, or
you
work through them?
You work through them. I think the biggest thing that, and I'm now starting to make, the choices to do it myself. I don't have a lot of closeness to me from people. Relationships were really tough when I first started to try to date again. I didn't really trust anybody.
Why would you?
Yeah, but I've got a good, solid, 3-year relationship under my belt now. And he really helps me be my most authentic self. My life right now is all about, this is going to sound a little weird, but I'm trying to have fun. I'm trying to have fun. If it's Tuesday and I want to go to happy hour, I'm going to go to happy hour. If I want to lay in bed and read a book, I'm going to lay in bed and read the book. But what I have noticed about myself is I'm still engrossed in my job, but not nearly as obsessive as I was in my 20s and 30s. I tell the people who work for me all the time, like, when you're laying on your deathbed, the last thing that you're going to say is, man, I wish I had worked more.
Yeah, I know. I learned that lesson too. I know. I think you have to go through it. You have to learn what's important in life, what the balance is. And then again, I always say, those are your choices. You choose how you shape your future.
Yeah.
From who you hang out with to your job to who you let into your life. So
right.
I don't want to cry, but I thank you.
Yeah. You got to figure it out, you know?
Your sharing is amazing. I want to thank you so much.
Oh, smart.
Shut up, Dominic. Our producer, Dominic, says, Margie, you cry. Because you opened your heart. And a lot of people don't do that.
I think the reason why I do it now as an adult is that there are so many kids out there who think that their destiny is just the chaos that surrounds them. And they don't need somebody to hand them anything on a silver platter. I had zero privilege for the first 20 years of my life, none. And I didn't go hungry, and I watched violence, and I watched people die, and all of these things that happened, and it would have been incredibly easy for me to stay. It would have been easier for me to stay there. So I don't believe in you're a victim of your circumstance at all. I don't buy that. I don't think that it's a valid excuse for anything. Because where you choose to go in your life is 100% dictated by you and your own inner drive to not do that anymore.
Exactly.
You don't like what you're doing right now.
Change it.
Change it.
You don't like the people around you. Change it.
Change it. Life.
You don't like the way you look. Change it.
That's it.
It's not that easy, but change it.
But it is. Change it. There is zero valid excuses for being unhappy in a circumstance.
Well, we will end it on that. Love you for coming in. Oh my God, soulmate here. Thank you to Anna Boulay. This has been an amazing, amazing episode. And thank you for joining Choices with Margie. And come back and see us again.
Thank you, guys.